to take it away. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, my name is Duane Wegner. I chair the psychology department here at Ohio State. And I'm also involved with a new collaborative on campus, a collaborative for the science of polarization and misinformation. And that is just starting. We just hired a first faculty director who will join us next fall. That is a part of this effort. I was really appreciative of the fact that when I started meeting cybersecurity included misinformation as a threat that is a key part of that. And we heard in a number of portions of this morning already how that when information that people put out is labeled as false, that then has implications. And of course, when you talk about phishing and other kinds of threats, people are constitute a huge part of the vulnerability there. And a lot of that comes down to misleading claims. How can we get people to do something that they otherwise wouldn't want to do, or to believe something that maybe they otherwise wouldn't want to believe, or that we might not want them to believe? I'm going to approach this from a context that is somewhat broader. I want to talk a little bit about well, first of all, what we will do during our time today, we're going to highlight some of the work from our labs. Of course, that fits within a broader context. And I want to hit a few themes that work with the theme for today in terms of disinformation undermining trust. And then also hopefully give a little food for thought about future work that just isn't done yet. My background is as a social psychologist. I study attitude change and persuasion. And so when we think about those misleading kinds of claims, of course, many of the different features that are a part of any claim are absolutely relevant to that kind of context. And if you look at the last 100 or so years of research in psychology on persuasion, people have identified a variety of different aspects of any kind of claim, including things related to the source of that claim, who's making it, the recipient, who's receiving that claim, the message itself that's being provided, and the context in which that occurs. I just listed a number of things that have been studied over the years. We'll touch on some of those during the time today. And a good portion of them have at least been touched on in the misinformation domain, but many have not yet. And many have not in the kind of fidelity or nuance that we know from persuasion more generally should be relevant. Of course, all of those same features are also relevant when it comes into the attempt at correction. Who is it that's trying to correct this claim? Who's receiving, that attempt at correction? How is that message formed, and what context is it received? All right, so just to give you a little bit of a deeper background on the way we've studied this in our labs, and certainly there are some ways in which we've intentionally removed this from some of the contexts in which people might receive the kinds of misleading claims that we all would care about in this room. But we have studied this in some ways that are very controlled, so that we have control over what the misinformation is itself, as well as control over how it's corrected and by whom. And so some of these paradigms were developed in cognitive psychology, and they took a very memory-oriented view to it. I'd be happy to talk more about that, but I'm mostly going to skip over that today. But they did things like set up a specific context where they tell a story about a warehouse fire, and there's a key piece of information in that story that says that there was some flammable material that was improperly stored, and that's what made an initial spark grow into this fire that burns down this warehouse. They set that up so that they know exactly what the misinformation is, and then within certain conditions at least, they then later give a correction that says, actually, the fire investigator has determined that, in fact, there was no flammable material stored in that particular place, so that presumably people should then not believe that there was improperly stored material, afterwards, you should be able to find that if you ask them about it, or if you ask them to make inferences about that, they should not be assuming or treating as true this initial misinformation. What they found, of course, is that people continue to act as if that information was true. And they call that continuing influence effect, is that that belief never decreases to zero. People continue to use it, act as if it's true. And in that context, what we have primarily examined is aspects of the source of the misinformation as well as the correction or retraction. And I'll come around to that again in just a little bit, but that's one context in which we've examined those kinds of variables. In another kind of context, we created something similar on our own where we give people some information about a purported influence. And so we give them a story of sorts, but we say that over a particular period of time, there was this decrease in violent crime within a particular state or particular county. And over that same period, this reporting agency is saying that the rate of gun ownership either increased in certain conditions or decreased in various conditions. Now, why do we do both of those in different conditions? We do that partly because for someone who themselves is pro-gun control, for example, one of those stories fits with what they would like to be true and the other does not. And for someone who is pro-gun ownership and thinks that gun ownership will actually have influences for crime, then for them the opposite set of conditions is true, where one of those stories fits for what they would like to be true and the other does not. And in that context, we have examined a number of things, including how those prior attitudes or beliefs that the person holds might change their reactions to corrections, as well as some aspects of the message and of the sources in those situations. Again, I'm going to come around to this and review some of this. So, as I mentioned before, those kinds of things like sources are relevant both to the misinformation itself and to the correction. And I mentioned before that in some cases, the correction is actually a retraction. As Connor mentioned earlier, you might have someone say, oh, we didn't have those facts straight. This is actually what's true, right? The initial message wasn't quite right. Here's what's actually true. Well, in that kind of context, in some ways, a retraction should maximize the credibility of the source in that there's no real reason for them to say we got it wrong unless they really believe they got it wrong, right? There's little reason to question the motives of that person. Whereas if it's a third-party correction, a lot of times you are questioning the motives of that person that's labeling, or that source that's labeling the information as false. And it turns out that retractions are overall more effective than third-party corrections, probably partly for that reason. And so in that kind of context, certainly the more credible a source of the misinformation is, the more impact that information will have. The more credible the correcting source is, the more impact that will have. So that makes it really important, and I think Kelly will address some of this later, to have tools to be able to identify, well, what are the credible sources? What are the non-credible sources? In our own work, we've been able to look at expertise and trust in the context of correcting sources. In the misinformation, one of the things that we run into is in the misinformation domain, sometimes they'll say things that from a broader persuasion context, you say, that can't be right. And in fact, about 10 years ago, people were claiming that in the misinformation domain, it was all about trust and expertise didn't matter. That if you trusted the person, you would go with what they say, and if you didn't, you wouldn't. But of course, we had 80 years worth of work in persuasion saying, no, of course, expertise matters. And if you create the conditions correctly, it turned out their manipulations had been kind of confounded, where their experts also had a vested interest and their non-experts did not. And that was offsetting their expertise effects. If you create the context appropriately, we were able to show, no, of course, expertise of the corrector also absolutely makes a difference. We also were able to show in our lab, and this is with Tori Westbrook, who was an Air Force funded student in my lab. I've had a couple of these students. Tori was the first that is funded by the Air Force. They're in information operations. And of course, in the military, there are a lot of situations where, if the military, for example, is going into a new theater of operations, they may very well be dealing with misinformation that's been spread by an adversary in that context. And so understanding how misinformation works and how efforts at corrections work are really important in those kinds of contexts. And what Tori was looking at is how, and this is sort of what Connor mentioned earlier too, is that in a situation where a correction occurs, even a third-party correction, it does work to undermine the credibility of the source of the initial misinformation. So when someone learns that what you said previously was false, that does undermine credibility. And we were able to show that that was part of what determined the ongoing influence or lack thereof of that misinformation. We also, in that context, provided causal impact or evidence of causal influences of source derogation in that context, because if you include in the correction a derogation of the source of the misinformation, that then increased the impact of that correction. Now, of course, that's a pretty blunt instrument, right? Because if you derogate the source of the misinformation, and maybe there are some contexts in which you want to do that, right? You don't want people to believe anything that this other source has to say. But there are some contexts where you really wish that later that same source can be credible again, right? And so it raises these questions about if you have lost credibility because something you didn't have your facts straight and you were called out as spreading false information, how do you then regain that credibility later, right? That can be a huge challenge, right? And I'm not saying that, this work also kind of cautions against, you don't want to necessarily broadly just derogate sources of all misinformation, because there are some times where you really want it to be only located with this topic or this particular statement, right? You don't want the impact to be for any future information that you get from that source, right? Another type of thing that we've looked at is, and this deals with those recipient prior beliefs and attitudes that they might hold. So what we were able to do in the gun control kind of paradigm is show that, in fact, that people who are receiving a correction that says something I wish was true is actually false, they experience discomfort with that. And that discomfort then, in fact, has causal influences that motivates them to continue to believe that misinformation. So that misinformation that I wanted to be true and someone labels as false, even if it's a retraction, that discomfort that is experienced in that situation motivates people to continue to believe that misinformation after that correction. And we were able to provide evidence that there is a causal impact of that as well. So, for example, if you get people to misattribute that discomfort to something else in the environment other than the correction, it actually makes them open to that correction and they lower their belief in that misinformation. So if I'm experiencing discomfort, but it's because there is music in the environment that was pre-tested to be kind of discordant and make people uncomfortable, that actually opens them to the correction because they can attribute that discomfort to the music instead of to the correction, right? So that's just we partly did that because the cognitive work on correction of misinformation took a very memory and cognitive oriented view. And we wanted to show, no, there's absolutely a motivational component to that as well. And that goes into a lot of domains where people have started studying things like identity and looking at how if misinformation is something that is kind of identified as part of what a good group member believes, right? Then there's motivation to continue to believe that even in the face of corrections, right? So, all right, let me, also one thing that we have started looking at, this is with Kelly Amadio. Kelly is a PhD student funded by the Air Force, and she is looking at contexts in which the correcting source has some ambiguity involved with it. So if you think about sources, there are lots of times where, for example, there's some kind of mixed characteristic to that person. So maybe the person is an expert, for example, but they also have a vested interest in you believing what they have to say. You think about a lot of sales contexts like this, where you have maybe a doctor who has a lot of expertise, but they're hawking a product that they absolutely are selling, right? They have a mixed characteristic to them. And what she's shown there is that those background attitudes and beliefs that the person holds, especially hold sway in continued belief in that misinformation when the correcting source has that kind of mixed character to them. because basically the person can think of that correcting source the way they would like to think of them. If I want to believe what they have to say, they're an expert. If I don't want to believe what they have to say, they have a vested interest. They're trying to fool me, right? And so we've been able to look at that in the context of human sources. We have also looked at that in the context of automated sources. So and this is work actually that is done with Kelly and with Srini Parthasarathi and in computer science here at Ohio State. And we've looked at when you get a fact check from an automated or AI source. The state of the art these days is even the best systems are going to be right maybe 70% of the time in terms of identifying just with free text whether this is a true or false statement. But if you have a 70% correct source, well, that leaves a lot of wiggle room for the person to say, well, if it's telling me something I want to hear, this is probably one of the 70% of the times that they're right. But if it's something I don't want to hear, it's probably one of the 30% of the time that it's wrong. Right. And so it allows those prior beliefs to hold sway in continued belief beyond that. Right. So, yeah, so I do want to turn it over to Kelly so he can tell you a little bit about some of his work, and I'll come back in just a bit.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Kelly Garrett. I'm a professor and the director of the School of Communication. Like Duane, I've been studying misinformation for quite a while. And if you work in this misinformation space for any length of time, you may have a tendency to become a bit cynical, maybe even a bit pessimistic about humans' ability to process information. And, there's some reason for that. But today I want to just highlight a couple ways in which scholars of misinformation have sometimes been a little too pessimistic. We've sometimes gone too far in our cynicism around what people are able to do and the kinds of mistakes they make. The first thing I want to do is talk about two ways in which corrections are uniquely effective. Duane's alluded to some of the stuff already. I'm going to try and steer clear of the stuff he's already talked about, but you'll see some overlap. The first thing that I want to drive home is that corrections work, right? A lot of intuition, a lot of people's initial reaction when they think about corrections is, well, they don't make any difference. You can tell someone they're wrong 1,000 times and it's never going to change what they believe. And that's simply not true. Now, it doesn't have the kind of powerful effects we might like. In this fabricated fire story that Duane was just describing, you'd like to think that when you tell someone, no, the experts, the ones who told you that the source of the fire was this flammable material, they are now telling you, oh, it wasn't that. You'd like to think everyone would just say, okay, so that doesn't matter. It doesn't work that way. People correct, but they correct slowly. And why they correct slowly is something that we're still trying to understand. It does seem to be partially motivational. It does seem to be partially cognitive. And there's a sort of sense-making thing going on. Like if people can't find a better way of making sense of what they're seeing, then the logical, rational explanation of like, well, here's the evidence doesn't matter because they still want to make sense of it. Okay, so um, how many of you have heard of this thing called a backfire effect? I'm just curious how prevalent it is. Okay, so that's great. About a decade ago, there was a big concern that corrections might actually work in the opposite direction that we want. We might actually expose people to corrections, and then people would become less accurate because of their motivational processes. And, okay, it happens once in a very great while, but it's really hard to get that to happen. So good news, corrections work in that sense. Let me say a few things about the ways in which corrections effectiveness varies, because there are a bunch of factors that shape how effective these tools are. The more often you've seen misinformation, the harder it is to unseat. Merely being exposed to a false claim increases the sense that it's true and your confidence in that belief. We may have seen some evidence of this in the political environment over the last, I don't know, 8, 10 years, where repeated falsehoods, even after correction, the people who are making these false claims hold to the claims and repeat them again. That appears to be a pretty effective tool for getting people who don't have, even if they don't have a horse in the race, even if it's not motivational, it's just this heuristic that we use. The familiarity of a claim is a proxy for how believable or how accurate the claim is likely to be. Another thing we've found is that complex corrections tend to do less well than simple ones. And that's kind of a problem if you're an academic like me and you like to actually explain everything. Like the reason this is wrong is da 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 da, and you also have to be paying attention to the da da. No, people don't want that. It doesn't work that well. You're much better off saying, this is false. Um, Duane talked quite a bit about the belief consistency and sort of motivational approaches. So I'm not going to say a lot about this. Um, but briefly, we know that if a falsehood is good for your in-group, or if it aligns nicely with things that you already believe, you are going to accept it without a lot of careful consideration. We just don't vet stuff that lines up with what we want to believe or what we already believe. Whereas if it challenges what we want to believe, or if it's inconsistent with what we already know, we do look at it very carefully. We read it carefully. We look at the source. We try and poke holes in it. And you know what? This is actually a very rational strategy, and it works in a lot of situations because most of the time, when you hear someone say the sky is orange, and you're like, yeah, no, I don't think so. Most of the time when you hear something that sounds very inconsistent with what you already believe and what you already know, it's very rational to be skeptical of that claim. The problem is that it can be exploited. Bad actors take advantage of the fact that we are biased by our predispositions, by our prior knowledge, to create falsehoods that become that we are vulnerable to. Um, Interestingly, these kinds of biases, there is some evidence that there are differences, both in individual characteristics and in situational characteristics that can make these biases bigger or larger. So, for example, the meta-analyses out there looking at lots of data from lots of different studies suggest that conservatives seem to be slightly more likely to be biased towards claims that are reinforcing their prior predispositions. There aren't great explanations for why, right? These are analysis. They aren't getting at the causal mechanisms. They're just saying, well, we see this time and again in a lot of studies, these kinds of biases seem to be playing out. Could be a product of the social environment, the way the messages are being delivered. There are a lot of possible explanations, but it's worth being aware of that trend. Also, we know, for example, that when someone has been ostracized, made to feel excluded from a group, from their social group, their responsiveness to messages, to corrective messages, goes down. They're less likely to accept this corrected belief if the belief challenges their in-group's values. So, as Duane said, there is a lot of nuance that we're trying to reintroduce into this literature on misinformation and corrections because the early stuff was just like in the early 2000s, people said, oh, there might be something going on online. By the middle of the 2010s, 2015s, people were like, I think there's something going on. 2016, people were like, oh my God, dumpster fire, right? So now we're trying to back up a little bit and let's put a little more nuance in this. Um, I think that this credibility stuff, Duane's talked about it, so I'm not going to make too much of this. But it's also interesting to remember that the credibility works in two directions, right? The credible sources do make you more likely to accept corrections, but corrections that go against your intuitions or contradict your beliefs tend to reflect poorly on the credibility of the original source, which creates a really complicated dynamic because it gets hard to know which one is going to dominate. And finally, there are a variety of interesting individual differences. People differ in how important they think the evidence is. There are people who will tell you, I just don't care what the evidence says. That's not important to me. There are people who say, I can feel what's true. I don't need reason. I don't need logic. I don't need facts. I know. That's the best way to tell. Okay. Um, that was the first like corrections work. Second, I'm going to do this briefly because I want to get it back to Duane. Corrections also on social media, they work because they change people's behavior. If you hop on to Facebook or Reddit and you see a false claim and you post a fact check, a link to a site that provides factual information that suggests that the claim being shared is false. We have multiple studies using huge amounts of data that show one of the first things that happens is that engagement with that content drops very rapidly. People stop sharing it and they stop talking about it. And that is powerful, right? One of the big things we want to do with misinformation is beat it before it spreads. Like trying to correct it's hard. It works, but it's slow going. If you can just keep it from getting out there in the first place, great. Now the problem is the people who are sharing it are spreading it in lots of little places. You start a lot of little fires and you got a bigger chance of starting a forest fire than if you start just one. So they're spreading it lots of places. But to the extent that we can convince everyday Americans to get out there and police those fires and stomp on them with a link to a fact check, um, it can be a very effective strategy. I'm going to skip this next one so that you have time to wrap up.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I just want to mention, I don't want to get us too far behind, so I want to make sure that I will probably gloss over a bit of this as well, but I think that so in the persuasion domain, we've talked about, each of these kinds of features, but one of the really important aspects of the last, 100 or so years of research in this domain is that, in fact, there is this very important underlying context for all of this. And this is, how deeply are people thinking about the information that they're receiving? And so Kelly mentioned, in some places that something like a simple, this is false, or simple correction may be more effective. That may reflect partly the fact that many of the people that are receiving that correction are not thinking that much, right? They're scrolling through, and if it's attention grabbing, they'll give it the 8 seconds or whatever, but that's it, right? But there is lots and lots of work that has occurred over the last, especially 50 years or so, saying that there's a continuum of what is referred to as elaboration. And elaboration is basically how deeply are you thinking about it? Elaborating in terms of connecting it to all the other background knowledge that you have, right? And there are different kinds of outcomes that occur at different levels of elaboration, and there are different outcomes of those things. I'm going to sort of speed past a couple of things here and just note that I do this in my class when I teach this to students, but let's just take something like credibility, right? So credibility of a source, right? Well, okay, if you're not thinking about it much at all, you can use that credibility as a simple cue, right? If this person knows what they're talking about, that's good enough for me. That's all I need, right? We'd refer to that as a cue effect, right? So you can get a very simple effect of credibility in that way. But the thing is, if you have really good, clear information, and that information is pulling in one direction, but source credibility is pulling in another direction. So you're giving, like you have a low credibility source, but there's a really good argument that they can give, right? If you can push people up to a higher level of elaboration, those source effects will go away because they'll be persuaded by that compelling information, by that compelling argument, right? And so that's what's referred to over here as argument effects, right? If you can push people to focus on the available information, you can reduce those cue effects, right? The thing is, in some contexts, the information isn't so clear. It may be ambiguous. And if it's ambiguous, you can get what I've referred to as bias processing up there, where you actually think different things based on who the source is. I interpret the information more favorably if I view the source as credible than if I view the source as non-credible. So you can be thinking a lot, but because the information itself doesn't kind of overwhelm what the source has to say, the information itself is ambiguous, I'm still absolutely going to show credibility effects there, even though I'm thinking a lot, right? And then there are some times where, in fact, the source can motivate you to think or not to think, right? So, in fact, you could change the amount of elaboration just based on who's giving you the message, right? So the things that we've learned in persuasion more generally are a lot more complicated than what we've done in misinformation to this point, right? And so, I think that, and why do we care about that? I'm just going to, at the bottom there, right? The thing is, attitudes that are formed in that thoughtful, elaborative kind of way last longer over time, and they have more impact on thinking and behavior. And so when we can get people to that high end of elaboration, you then create these kinds of beliefs that people will act upon and that they will hold over time. And so in some contexts, I mean, part of what Srini and his team are doing with automated fact checking is trying to create explainable fact checks, right? So that they give more information about it. Well, from the human side of this, from persuasion, we would say that's only going to matter if you can get people motivated enough to then think through the explanation. Because if you don't, that simple correction is actually going to be more effective. Right? And so by combining the human side of knowing something more about what we need to create the beliefs that will then transmit into behaviors, if we can combine that with what, and people are super interested in automated fact checking because you can do it at scale, because you don't have to have that army of people out there stamping out all the little fires, because if you can build that into the system and you have fact checks that are coming up as people encounter the information, it gives, it gives us possibilities we don't have just relying on people. But if we're going to do that, we better take into account who's receiving it, what they do with it, right? So anyway, it would take us, we could do another week of just persuasion and how it's relevant in this context. But I hope that the short time today has given you some idea, and be super happy to follow up with anyone outside of today or later today. But thank you very much for your time.